Today we are going to be looking at graphing linear inequalities. So you need to turn to that page in your interactive notebook. Graphing linear inequalities. It would be the last page that we have glued in. As we are graphing linear inequalities, we are going to be starting out the same process as what we did when we were graphing linear equations. We're focusing now on inequalities. We've worked with inequalities before, less than, greater than, those kinds of things. So first thing we're going to do is fill in the top part of your form with these 5 steps that you're going to go through. So step 1 is to solve for y. So we've been solving equations for y since probably the beginning of November, writing equations in slope-intercept form. Step 2 is to graph using our slope and y-intercept. So again, something that we have been doing for a long time. Once our equation is solved for y, we can graph using our slope and our y-intercept from that slope-intercept form. Okay. So that's what we've been doing. Okay. Now with graphing linear inequalities, a couple other small things that you need to think about. 3 is we need to determine if we're going to use a solid line or a dashed line. And we will look specifically at that here in a minute. The graphing that we've always done with the equations, we've always used a solid line. We're going to talk about when we might use a dashed line. And then because we're working with a linear inequality, we are going to be shading on one side of the line. And again, here in a minute, we'll look at how we determine that. And then this last piece where we see those 3 asterisks, just a couple of reminders again from graphing. Okay. If we don't have something in slope-intercept form because we don't have both a y and an x, we know that if we have just y equal to a number, we have that horizontal line. And if we have just an x equal to a number, it's a vertical line. So those are the steps that we are going to be working with today. Okay. So those first 2 steps, again, we've been doing that for some time because we're now working with an inequality instead of an equation. We've just got a couple additional pieces to look at. Whether we're going to use a solid or dashed line, what part we're going to shade. So going down the left side of the page in your interactive notebook, we have these boxes. The first one you see is for a solid line. Okay? We already know from equations that we use a solid line if it's an equal sign. With our inequalities that we're going to be working with, because solid is equal, our inequalities would be that less than or equal to sign and the greater than or equal to symbol. So if we're including that equals piece, then we make it a solid line. We're including all the points that are on the line. We will use a dashed line then if we don't have that equal to bar. So if it's just a less than or a greater than symbol without the equal to bar, we will use the dashed line. And then step 4 involved that shading. So we need to know which part of the graph is going to be shaded. We can shade either above or below. So we are going to be shading above when we solve for y and we have either the greater than or the greater than or equal to symbol. Because if we want our y's to be greater, we're going to go up the y-axis. So we're going to shade up. So then we're going to be shading below then if we have the less than or the less than or equal to symbol. Because if our y's are less, we want to go down the y-axis. So for those two new pieces, we're going to be just looking at that inequality symbol. Okay? The math work that we do is all the same as equations. With the inequalities, that'll help us determine if it's a solid or a dashed line, if we're going to shade above or shade below. So we're going to do the example and apply those. So again, our first step says we need to solve for y. So I have the equation 2x minus 3y is less than 12. So what's the first thing I'm going to do towards getting that y by itself? Okay, I'm going to move the x to the other side. How do I do that? Okay, I do the opposite. So I'm going to subtract 2x from both sides. Very important that you drop down the negative with the 3y. Do we keep our inequality or do we have to flip it if we're subtracting from both sides? We're going to keep it. Need to remember those inequality rules from first semester. Again, I always like to write my x term first, so negative 2x, and then my positive 12. Then what will my next step be? I'm going to divide everything by negative 3 with the y. Negative 3 divided by negative 3 becomes positive, so I just have my y. If I'm dividing by a negative 3, do I keep my sign or flip it? I need to flip it. How do we know when we have to flip that inequality sign? When we multiply or divide both sides by a negative number. That was that golden rule of inequalities we had first semester. So because we were dividing by a negative 3, we had to flip our sign. Okay. So then when we finish this out, a negative 2 divided by a negative 3 is a positive 2/3 x. 12 divided by a negative 3 is negative 4. So I solved for y, step 1. Step 2 says to graph using slope and y-intercept. So looking at this inequality, where am I going to start my graph? Negative 4 on the y-axis. Then from that point, I'm going to move slope, which is the 2/3. So that's my rise and my run. So I'm going to rise 2, run 3. And I get a point. Again, I can continue to repeat that. Rise 2, run 3. Or I could come back to where I started and go down 2 and back 3. Because it's very important that we are accurate in drawing our line. So now I'm ready to connect those points with my straight edge. Looking at my inequality, am I going to use a solid line or a dashed line? Okay. Because I don't have the equal to bar, I'm going to use a dashed line. So I line up my straight edge. That's not going to work on the board for me to do that. But you're just going to dash the line rather than make it solid. So you're going to have spaces in between. And then I need to do my shading. So again, looking at my inequality, am I going to shade above or below? Greater than? Above or below? Above. Okay, because the y is there, I want my y's to be greater. So if I'm at my y-axis, where my point was on my y-axis, I want to go above that. So everywhere above my line is going to be shaded. So any point that is in the shaded area would make my inequality true. Okay. So, although we can't check exactly, we can get a good idea, especially about the shading, okay, by choosing a point in the shaded area to check. The easiest point to check is the origin 0, 0, because it is in that shaded area. Okay. So as long as it's in the shaded area, we can check it. So if I wanted to check that origin 0, 0, I put 0 in place of my x and 0 in place of the y. So on the left side, what do I have? 0 is less than 12. And that is a true statement, which means that point should be shaded. So as long as your line doesn't go through the origin is the easiest thing to check. Otherwise, you could choose any point in the shaded area. Make sure it's true, then you know you shaded on the correct side. So that is our graphing linear inequalities. A couple other things that I want to talk about briefly. On the worksheet that I'm going to be handing out for your assignment, after you do the graphing, it's a puzzle worksheet, and to fill in the puzzle, it's going to have you matching up criteria. One of the things it talks about are the quadrants that our solution is in. So when we have this graph, our x and y axes divide that into 4 sections. It starts in the upper right-hand section, okay, which is quadrant 1, and they use Roman numerals. Then it goes counterclockwise. So we have quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and quadrant 4. So which of the quadrants have shading done for this example that we did? I see shading in 1, 2, 3, and a little bit in 4. So it's all 4 quadrants. And then it's going to ask if it includes or excludes the line. We have a dashed line for this one. Do you think a dashed line would be includes or excludes? Pardon? Excludes. Okay. Because we have the dashed line, a dashed line is excludes. Okay, we're not counting the points on the line. If it's a solid line, it would be includes. So what we're going to be doing today is using those steps that we wrote in the beginning, using those steps, solve for y, graph using our slope and our y-intercept. New things to think about is that solid or dashed line and the shading above or below. And then those 2 special cases. You will see some of those on your assignment.